In clustering problems, the unseen hidden state determines the distribution of features that we see within the different clusters. When we talked about k-means and other clustering algorithms last week, we were not very specific about the distributions that implied. In essence, we just restricted ourselves to saying there was some spatial relationship expressible through distance in the feature space. And the way that these distributions worked was pretty much symmetrical, and we imposed hard boundaries between the different cluster regions. We could pose this problem in a more general sense by saying that the features are drawn from some kind of random distributions which are conditioned on the hidden state variables. We can then be bit more specific about what those kind of distributions are and what the relationships between the visible, measurable properties and the unseen states might be. One way of looking at this is to imagine that for each unseen state there is a single true value and then some kind of noise distribution associated with that state, and the distribution for each state might be different. As so often when dealing with these kind of noise distributions, one useful way forward is to assume that the noise has a Gaussian distribution. This leads us to models that are mixtures of Gaussians. If we assume that the noise for each hidden class is distributed as a multivariate Gaussian with some mean feature vector mu and some covariance matrix sigma, then the overall model with all of the different classes can be expressed as a weighted sum of these different Gaussian distributions like this. In this case, the weights for each of the distributions, represented by the alpha I, correspond to the probability of an observation being drawn from any of the particular classes. Given a large enough number of these distributional blobs for the separate Gaussians k, you can use this to represent an arbitrarily complex distribution. As with k-means, we will assume that the choice of the number of contributing Gaussians, just like the choice of the number of classes, this number k is a hyperparameter that will be chosen externally by some other means and that doesn't form a part of the immediate model estimation or fitting process. To fully express this, also, we need to define what sort of relationship the alphas have. We're going to assume that the class membership is distributed multinomially with some probability vector that represents the chance of being in each of the different Gaussians. So, of course, we've posed this problem in terms of a mixture of Gaussians with a whole bunch of parameters associated with them, but we don't know what any of those parameters are. We don't know what the class probabilities alpha are. We don't know what the individual Gaussian means and covariances are. Somehow, we have to determine these from only the visible data. The key to doing so, and to most of the problems that we're looking at today, is to recognize that if we did know some of these things, then the problem would actually be pretty easy. If we knew which Gaussian each individual sample came from, then we would be able to separate out the samples into single Gaussian distributed sets and fit a single multivariate Gaussian to each one. In this case, the means would be the mean for each individual group, the covariance would be the covariance for each individual group, and the class membership probabilities would just be the proportion of the samples overall that we've assigned to the class. These are all standard maximum likelihood estimates that we could represent like this. So that's a nice fantasy, but we don't know the class memberships, and instead we wind up with completely intractable likelihood expressions that we have no way of optimizing. The kind of superficial expression of this is that the likelihood functions wind up taking logs of sums which don't have a very well-defined solution, but the underlying cause is that each of the things depends on another thing that we don't know. As with k-means, we can choose just to break this impasse by making a guess. We can use that guess to then iteratively refine partial solutions that depend on previous partial solutions until we get something that we're satisfied with. Unlike k-means, in the case of a mixture of Gaussians, we're not going to make hard class assignments. Instead, we're going to make soft, probabilistic assignments of class memberships. That is, for each sample in the training set, we will predict a distribution, a vector of probabilities that the sample belongs to each of the possible classes. These probabilities are also known as responsibilities. They are the degree to which we believe that any given sample belongs to any given class. The way that we proceed to fit this model iteratively from a starting guess uses a process called expectation maximization, which was mentioned last week in the context of k-means clusters. We'll first look at this in the specific case of how it applies to Gaussian mixtures, and then generalize slightly in terms of how it works with any old distribution. The EM algorithm breaks down into two parts, two steps, which are iterated alternately until you converge to a solution. In the E step, or expectation step, we estimate the responsibilities associated with each of the samples using a formulation like this. In the second step, we make maximum likelihood estimates of all of the model parameters based on the responsibilities like this. These are just re-expressions of the maximum likelihood estimates shown before for a single Gaussian, but instead expressed using a weighting by the responsibilities. The actual calculations here for the E step and the M step are pretty straightforward. The process is relatively easy to understand and relatively easy to implement. So Gaussian mixture models of this kind are very widely used, and they're used sort of for two different purposes. First, to do actual soft class membership assignment, a sort of soft clustering, but also to generally model distributions. So if you have a weird shaped distribution, you don't really care about membership of different parts of it, but you want to model the likelihood of the whole thing. So for example, to tell whether a given sample is part of this complex distribution or not, then you can approximate that distribution just as a combination of blobs fitting the features in a complex space. One thing that we've glossed over here is that the process has to start somewhere. You have to be able to make some kind of initial guess. The initial guess in this case will be of the model parameters, the Gaussian means, the mu's, and the covariance is sigma, and also the class memberships. There are some fairly natural ways to do this, for example by randomly selecting points to be the initial means, similar to how we did in k-means clustering, and starting with a completely uniform initial distribution of cluster memberships. But other initialization schemes may alternatively be used. So Gaussian mixture model fitting is more computationally intensive and slower than k-means clustering, so it's quite common to do an initial k-means clustering pass to generate the initial starting conditions for a subsequent Gaussian mixture model fit. It is also common to run the algorithm multiple times from different initial conditions and just pick whichever one comes out with the best fit, the highest likelihood outcome. For example, the Gaussian mixture class in scikit-learn has automatic support both for using a k-means initializer and also doing multiple runs and picking the best. Initialization is important because the algorithm is not guaranteed to converge to a global maximum likelihood, only to a local maximum. So it is susceptible to getting stuck in local maxima, which may be significantly suboptimal.